So we can be confident that God is going to find us if we put ourselves in a position to be found. Now, sometimes when God finds us, we might find ourselves struggling in life, or maybe even suffering. Sometimes we can suffer physically, sometimes we can suffer spiritually. But wherever we are, we can be confident that God's going to find us and that the church is going to find us. And both God and the church are going to love us in the beauty of who we are. One of the beautiful ways that God finds us and ministers to us in the midst of our suffering is through the sacraments, especially the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. So let's ask 3 more questions. What is the sacrament of the anointing of the sick? Who can receive the sacrament of the anointing of the sick? And what are some other commonly asked questions about the sacrament itself? Let's start with the first one. What is the sacrament of the anointing of the sick? Well, let's look at it this way. Whenever we find ourselves in life, whenever we're struggling, whenever we're suffering, we can find ourselves either struggling physically or spiritually. But God is going to minister to us both at the same time. We are incarnate beings. We have a body and a soul. God is going to minister to our body and our soul all at the same time. And when we suffer, we all have different responses to suffering. Some of us, whenever we struggle in life, whenever we find ourselves suffering, we close in on ourselves, try to figure out on our own. Perhaps there's a hopelessness. Maybe there's some despair. Maybe there's some anger. Sometimes, as we've discussed, whenever we suffer, it opens up questions. It draws us out of ourselves and it propels us into God. The sacrament of the anointing of the sick is a gift from the church to help us, especially when we're going through physical suffering, so that we don't turn it in on ourselves and we don't find ourselves alone. The beauty of the sacrament of the anointing of the sick is that the church meets us through the ministry of the priest. So very simply, one of the ways that the sacrament of the sick works is in 2 primary actions. First, the priest meets the person who is sick and suffering and prays over them in silence, asking for God's presence in their life. And then following that, using the oil that's blessed by the bishop, he anoints the person using the words of the scriptures themselves so that the person can receive the healing grace of God. Now, the beauty of the sacrament is such that the person can also go to confession. The person can receive the sacrament of reconciliation in the midst of the rite itself. And oftentimes, the person also receives the gift of the Eucharist so that the sacrament of the Eucharist can aid them and assist them in their healing. Second question, who can receive the sacrament of the anointing of the sick? Well, the Catechism reminds us that anybody who is facing either old age or serious illness can receive the sacrament. Let me give a couple examples. I remember just a few years ago, one of my family members was facing cancer. It's a pretty serious illness. And as they were facing not only the physical repercussions of that cancer, they were also facing their own emotions. As they received the sacrament with that serious illness, it gave them great hope. I'll give you a second example. I had a friend of mine who received open heart surgery. And as he was going into a very serious surgery, he too received the sacrament of the anointing of the sick because of the seriousness of the surgery. Third question, what are some of the commonly asked questions about the sacrament itself? Well, first of all, is it in the Bible? And the answer there is yes. The biblical roots of the sacrament of the anointing of the sick come from James, the letter of James. And there in the book of James, we see an invitation for those who are sick to call on the presbyter of the church, the priest of the church, and he will bring the blessed oil, and that the prayer of the priest and of the church will bless the person in their illness. So yes, there are biblical roots for the sacrament. We get it right there from James. Another commonly asked question is the sacrament only for those who are about to die? And that comes from a season in the church when they used to refer to it as last rites. I remember my mom and dad talking about the last rites. the sacrament that a person would receive before they would meet death. Well, the good news for all of us, as the Catechism reminds us, is that the sacrament is there for us, the Church is there for us whenever we are facing serious illness. So the sacrament is not just for those who have reached the end of their life, which begs the question, can a person receive it more than once? Well, absolutely. The Church wants to be with us in the midst of our suffering. And if our physical suffering is elongated, like my uncle who had cancer, the Church wants to minister to us in the midst of the suffering. So we've talked a lot about suffering today. And I hope you hear it as good news that God is with you in the midst of the suffering. I've suffered in my life, and I think that we're all honest with ourselves. Suffering is going to be a part of our lives. Maybe you are struggling, and maybe some people know about it. Or maybe no one knows. Maybe you're holding it close to your heart. If that's the case, a lot of times we can feel alone, as if nobody's there with us, especially God. But God is with you. He's suffering with you right here in your life, in your heart.